There are 12 months in a year, 12 hours on the face of a clock, 12 labors of Hercules, 12 apostles in Christianity, 12 zodiac signs. You get the point. There are probably many more things in the world that there are 12 of. But it's not really a number of significance, not as much as other numbers that have a deeper meaning, like 13 or 4, which are considered unlucky numbers, an ill omen. Some buildings straight up refuse to have these numbers as floors. And then you have the enigmatic number 7, a number that seems to be important in every major religion. So all this really makes you wonder why, out of all numbers, Pablo Neruda, the author of Keeping Quiet, chose 12. I am nothing against 12, but he uses it like a number of true significance, of true power. His opening and ending stanza both have the number 12. His first stanza even comprises of exactly 12 words. So it makes you wonder. The poem we are talking about today was written during a time of death and darkness, right after the end of World War II. You could say that at least they survived the war, but did the war really end? The war of countries were over, sure, but the war of the common man had just begun. Instead of rampant violence, it was a struggling economy. Instead of people being in an unforgiving battleground where one could lose their lives in a second, they're in an unforgiving office where they could lose their jobs in a second. The war had never really ended. It had just changed forms like a skinwalker and continued on its merry way. Pablo Neruda, by this point, was a world-famous poet. He should have escaped the war of the common man entirely, but he was facing the brunt of it. His decisions had ended in him being separated from his family and hated by the world. So he tried to solve his problems the only way he knew how, by writing a poem. This poem was supposed to be his answer to the chaos around him. And the poem's title consists of two words whose alphabets add up to exactly 12. And the name of that poem is Keeping Quiet.
Every year before I start writing all my books on January 8th. So a week before I start reading his poetry, because it brings me back my language. I live in English and I write in Spanish. And it also brings me back all the imagery and the flavor of Latin America, of Chile, of the things I care for.
To first understand the significance of 12, we need to understand the poem. And to understand the poem, we really do need to understand the man who wrote it. Pablo Neruda is the pen name of Ricardo Eliezer Basalto. Sorry if I butchered the name. Ricardo was born in the town of Perel in Chile to father Jose, a railwayman, and mother Rosa, a teacher at a local school. Growing up without a mother, Ricardo fell head over heels in love with literature, especially poetry, and he was good at it. He wrote his first poem at just the age of 10. His father, however, opposed Ricardo's writing. It's easy for us to criticize him now, especially knowing that Pablo would become one of Chile's most famous poets of all time. But you have to understand and look at it from his perspective. He was a salaryman living during the time of the First World War, a scale of war that the world has never seen before. So of course, he valued stable income over passion. Poetry seemed like an unprofitable and frankly unenviable career path for a son. You see, the creative arts weren't seen as a legitimate career path back then. It's not even seen as a legitimate career path right now by most. This story would have ended right here if it wasn't for the head of his local school encouraging him to keep writing and pursuing poetry. Her name was Gabriela Mistral. To the nerds in the audience, yes, that's the same Gabriela Mistral who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature just a few years later. Because of her encouragement, he went on to publish an essay at the age of 13 on a local daily. Gone was Ricardo Eliezer, and in his place, the world saw the birth of the legendary poet, Pablo Neruda. He went on to write more and more poems, and by the age of 20, he was already an internationally successful poet, mostly thanks to 20 love poems and a desperate song, which sold millions of copies. But even with these high sales numbers, he was still battling poverty. He moved from place to place and eventually married his first wife, Mariette Antonia, and had his first and only child, Malva Marina. He continued writing poems, but more out of desperation than art, praying that one of them sells like his first collection. During this time, we can see his poems' themes changing from love to politics. It was a strange shift for sure, but it was the Spanish Civil War that cemented his fate more as a diplomat and a politician than as a poet. He abandoned his family and only daughter to stay in France with Delia del Carril, a woman who was 20 years older than him, and married her the year after divorcing his first wife, Mariette. We can clearly see that his political views not only bled into his poetry, but also his daily life. He had come to admire communism and Russia as a country, and so began his cycle of poetry and politics, both which mished and mashed against each other until they both seemingly became one. He had to flee Chile, face exile, only to come back to Chile, then destroy his second marriage with Delia del Carril, having an affair with Matilde, who eventually went on to become his third and final wife. And because he was already a controversial and hated figure at the time, when his affair came to light, he was publicly ridiculed and humiliated. Emphasis on the word publicly. There are even art pieces of Matilde, who was a singer at the time, having Pablo Neruda's face on her famous long red hair. Which brings us to the 1950s. Pablo, who was a devout communist until now, slowly began to sober up and realize the flaws in the systems. He still believed in communism. In fact, he did so until his death, but he didn't believe it was a flawless system anymore. Pablo was broken down, disillusioned, divorced, living during a time where every move he made was followed by ridicule. A noisy world where everyone was rushing to hate, rushing to fight. So he sat down, dipped his pen in ink, and wrote down the first stanza of Keeping Quiet.
Now, we will count to 12, and we will all keep still.
From the very first line of this poem, we can already tell that this is not his usual style of poetry. It's not a love poem or a heavy-handed political poem. It's very introspective, dare I say, philosophical in nature, a theme that Neruda would continue on in his later works. In the sentence, counting to 12 introduces a structured pause, a reset. This brevity shows that the silence Neruda wants is not eternal. He doesn't want everyone to just stop and turn to stone, like Dr. Stone. He wants it to be a momentary, slow, reflective pause. The word we is used here instead of I. I want you to keep that little detail in mind. This emphasizes collectivity. He's not writing this only for himself. He's begging all of humanity to participate. And the words keep still doesn't only mean physical stillness. It also means mental and emotional stillness, all three of which are required for true reflection to begin.
For once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language.
Language was something Pablo Neruda dedicated his entire life to, but he asked everyone to abandon it. Language, in his opinion, was a source of division. It created linguistic barriers between people. So he asked everyone to transcend this barrier and be one.
Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much.
The focus of Pablo Neruda's criticism shifts from speech to action, especially in the phrase, not move our arms so much. This is a double entendre. Arms obviously represent our hands, but also arms as in weapons. This may seem preachy right now, especially if a modern author wrote it, but this was written during a time where violence seemed like the answer to every problem.
It would be an exotic moment without rush, without engines.
The word exotic implies something rare and extraordinary. Neruda imagines a peaceful world free from the noise of machines and the relentless rush of modern life. It also represents how far humanity is away from stillness, because a moment like this is almost unimaginable. It has never happened before, and in truth, let's be real, will never happen. Pablo was born in a town that gave him peace and quiet, but his choices eventually led him to the public eye. Yes, it brought him fame and money, but it cost him peace. He now wishes it back, not only for himself, but also for everyone. We also see the introduction of the environmentalist message here, a theme that would continue on throughout this poem.
We would all be together in a sudden strangeness.
The alliteration sudden strangeness suggests a transformative experience where shared silence feels familiar yet enlightening. The reason I said this was a strange line was because it's technically a paradox. Technically, Pablo says everyone to stop communicating, stand still, yet this is what connects all of humanity.
Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales.
This line is an obvious criticism of humanity's exploitation of nature. The fishermen represent the human industry, while the cold sea is yet another double entendre. Cold being a word to describe something that is indifferent towards suffering, which the sea being indifferent and emotionless to the destruction that humanity causes on it is cold. But it also means low temperature of the ocean, as in literally cold. Whales are yet another double entendre. You can see that this guy really likes his double entendres. Whales represent power, strength, wisdom. They represent the vastness of oceans. Whales are also a symbol of new beginnings. Very much like the number 12. You don't have to wonder, yes, that is foreshadowing. For now, all you have to know is that the fishermen or the human industry cannot harm the people during this time of silence.
And the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands.
The man gathering salt represents the laboring or working class, who go to work every day and come back home in an infinite cycle, never questioning what or why they're doing what they're doing. So in the 12 seconds he has to stay quiet, the man gathering salt looks at his hurt hands to see what his work has cost him. I think this line really resonated with Pablo because of what his work and passions have cost him. His first wife, his second wife, and his only daughter, all of whom he abandoned because of his passions.
Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire.
Green wars stand for deforestation and the damage we do to nature. Something that Pablo deeply felt considering Chile's agriculture sector facing low productivity and unequal land distribution post-World War II. Wars with gas evoke chemical warfare, while wars with fire evoke conventional warfare.
Victories with no survivors.
Unlike the other lines in this poem, there is no double entendre here. The question itself carries the importance of the line. A victory where there is no survivors questions the very concept of winning. What is the point if everyone dies? And if everyone dies, what's the point of winning?
Would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing.
On the surface level, this may seem like an out-of-place line. I mean, we were just talking about war, now we're talking about drip. But on a deeper reading, clean clothes symbolize redemption, purity, a fresh start, or the beginning of a new cycle. The line walking with their brothers is aimed at soldiers who caused death and destruction during the war, basically asking them to abandon all the negative aspects of war and embrace the good things war brought, kinship, brotherhood. He hops from redemption of the guilty to an image of peace, represented here cleanly by the shade. The shade may symbolize a protective space, a reprieve from the harshness of life's pressures. The second part of this sentence, the act of doing nothing, is yet another jab at humanity's obsession with overwork and productivity. But it can also be interpreted as laziness, something that Pablo addresses in the next line.
What I want should not be confused with total inactivity.
When you write a poem telling people to slow down, many people are going to think that you're talking about total inactivity. Neruda knows this and clarifies that this is for stillness, not stagnation. There is a distinction between stagnation and stillness. In theory, both of them could be used in place of each other, but stagnation evokes an image of lifelessness, while stillness evokes an image of growth and maturity.
Life is what it is about. I want no truck with death.
No truck with death basically cuts off the association with inactivity, which may lead to decay. See, inactivity not only leads to physical decay, but also psychological and mental decay. Something that could end up in nihilism. The belief that nothing really matters and nothing in the world has a real existence. A belief that some of us might fall into while we are facing hard times. Or at least I do.
If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving.
Kind of like a story or a very well-written speech, Pablo starts tying up all his loose ties. beginning with this line.
and for once could do nothing. Perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves.
The sadness Neruda describes stems from humanity's failure to understand itself. In the rush of life, people often neglect introspection, leading to a disconnection between their inner selves and from others. The true intention of the 12 seconds of silence was always this: to interrupt the sadness of never understanding oneself. We ignore what type of person we are, or even worse, what type of person we are slowly becoming. And that is truly sad, because not knowing who we are not only disconnects us from ourselves, but also from our loved ones.
And of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us.
The theme of alienation is continued here. Pablo Neruda calls out the self-destructive tendencies, including war, environmental exploitation, and many other things. But at the end, there seems to be a new force he's talking about. The phrase threatening ourselves with death is not only about literal violence that we commit against ourselves, but also the psychological toll of living disconnected, unknown lives. You see, being unknown by others is not a problem. I'm not asking you to cloud chase. But being unknown by oneself is, as we have already talked about. See, and this is the interesting part. After critiquing humanity so much, he turns to the earth as a teacher, suggesting that nature can guide humanity toward balance and renewal. By now, it's no secret that Pablo Neruda is an environmentalist. But I don't exactly think that this line is about nature. Not entirely, at least. You see, the earth has cycles of both beautiful life and hideous death, but ends both of these cycles when it comes the appropriate time. And if you're looking at it from this respect, where the cycle of hatred and war has to end, the earth really is the ultimate idol. And I know it's a really weird theory, but Pablo Neruda expands on this exact concept in the very next line.
As when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive.
The cycle of despair, war, hatred, time, and even life. Everything that grows is destined to end, but also to begin again. During winter, life appears to die, but then it's followed by the sudden birth of spring, which renews life. And just like winter, silence and introspection are not the end, but they're just the beginning. So let's answer the question you've all been waiting for. The significance of 12. When I first read this poem, I was confused too. I mean, why did a poem about rebirth and ending cycles have 12 as the number of significance? But that's when it clicked. A day ends after 12 a.m. is passed. A year ends when December, the 12th month, transitions to January the 1st. It is a number that simultaneously represents completeness and new beginnings. This was written right after the end of World War II, just for the economy to collapse and begin another economical war. It was as if winter came and never transitioned into spring, never blooming that beautiful green. So of course, Pablo Neruda, in a poem about ending cycles, chose 12, the number that ends cycles, to champion. But that's not the only reason why Pablo chose 12. He was 12 when he first wrote the essay that he published in his local daily at the age of 13. His marriage to his first wife lasted only 12 years. His marriage to his second wife lasted 12 years. 12 was the number that began him on this journey of literature. 12 was the number that gave him joy and heartache and everything in between. Now there's one more line in the poem that we have yet to analyze. So let's get to it.
Now, I'll count up to 12 and you keep quiet, and I will go.
The final few lines of the poem are mostly a repetition of the first, coming full circle, you could say. Pun very much intended. He again counts up to 12, but there's a small difference here. Did you catch it? It's the usage of you instead of we. And this makes sense when you look at the last three words, which are I will go. Pablo Neruda is no longer with us, but I believe he has made his case for silence. He steps back from the forefront and hands the responsibility to us, the readers. I truly in my heart believe that this poem was meant to outlast the poet Pablo Neruda. Our lives are ticking away and we will die. Like how autumn, which goes to winter, which goes to spring, which goes to summer, and back to autumn again, We are not part of the cycle. We are not endless. However, the concept of silence and reflection truly is. It will always be relevant. As I've already told you, the first stanza has 12 words, but the last stanza does not. It has more than 12, which means that the cycle has ended, and so has this video. Thank you so much for watching. I truly mean that. Goodbye.